Richard Nixon, when Now continues.
The death of Richard Nixon and his funeral here today has given us an opportunity to reflect on his public and private life. He was to the end a man of contradictions, almost painfully shy and reserved, yet always in the public arena. Politics were his life, and when he was elected America's 37th president, he was a man ready for that office, for the power, for the trappings, the place in history that comes with the address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He didn't let many see the inner workings of the Nixon presidency in personal style, but in 1971, my colleague John Chancellor and NBC News cameras spent a day with Richard Nixon. The program aired one time on NBC, and it has not been seen since. Now, almost a quarter of a century later, it is a portrait of history. Some of the people you'll see later would go to prison. 2 would become president. And in the middle of it all, Richard Milhouse Nixon. It was December 6th, 1971.
The president's schedule begins this day as he leaves his bedroom on the 2nd floor of the White House to go down to the 1st floor for breakfast with some friends and some enemies, the leaders of both parties in the Congress. He usually takes a quick look at the newspapers, but he does look at the sports pages with more care.
Almost down.
These meetings take place often.
But I haven't had a chance to talk to Mike about this, but the House is almost universally of the opinion that as late as it is...
The President of the United States, unlike most people, gets to walk to work about a quarter of a city block from the mansion to the offices in the West Wing, and he walks this day with House Republican leader Gerald Ford. Here, he warns Jerry Ford that a camera is pointed at him. The President was not unaware of the cameras while we were there. And this is the famous Oval Office, the President's official place of work. The President drinks several cups of coffee during the day, usually served by his valet, a Spanish-born American named Manolo Sanchez.
This has taken neutral position. Second, they feel that the UN position, which is overwhelmingly...
Henry Kissinger.
Okay? Fine. We'll call you later. All the trips are in good shape. Well, I don't know what we're going to do in our spare time. Just look at that schedule over the weekend. You seen it? Well, you leave for the Azores on Sunday afternoon. And we're in Bermuda the following Monday. We're in Key Biscayne the following Tuesday. And we're in California the following, Thursday.
And now, slipping in quickly in his usual chair, Robert Haldeman, Chief Executive Officer of the White House. And the President making a phone call to George Bush, our ambassador to the United Nations, with some instructions on India and Pakistan.
George, you had a rather lively time up there. If you see that some here in the Senate and the House, for whatever reason, get out and misrepresent our opinions, I want you to hit it frontally, strongly, and toughly. Is that clear? I mean, don't just take the gloves off and crack it, because you know exactly what we've done, okay? Fine. All right. Henry, why don't you bring those maps? I told the leaders this morning there were no people with the troops.
That's absolutely correct. No Americans with any.
No Americans with any of the troops, any place.
We have a variety of independent sources also.
Yeah, I know. None of them reliable.
None of them totally reliable.
That's right. Okay.
Bob Haldeman is the staff man who is probably closest to the President. The President gives orders to Haldeman, who gives them to cabinet members. This part of the morning is always busy. Here is John Ehrlichman, the Domestic Affairs Advisor, and Ronald Ziegler, the Press Secretary. Kissinger, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Ziegler are sometimes known as the German General Staff.
And we're just on a tightrope.
Domestic Council meeting in a few minutes.
Here's one of the men around the President we don't hear much about, Alex Butterfield, Deputy Assistant, who handles much of the paperwork. The amount of paperwork a president has to do is more than a lot of people realize. There are all kinds of official documents to be signed. And today, Butterfield and the President deal with a subtle matter of protocol for the summit meetings which are coming up.
deals with the protocol aspect of these upcoming bilateral meetings, and I think you'll agree I've staffed it out.
No photographs. They all have them. You see, you don't send an autographed photograph to somebody who already has an autographed photograph. Is that what he's talking about?
No, they do not have them, sir. We're just recommending...
Sato has one. Brown has one. I mean, I know because they've all paid... Anybody who's paid a visit here has an autographed photograph already.
Well, we'll check that out.
I don't like the photograph idea, frankly, too well.
Rosemary Woods, Mr. Nixon's personal secretary for nearly 21 years.
A lot of things. First, I wondered, would you like to send a note to Jackie Gleason? You know, you promised to go to his golf tournament.
Yeah. I really did promise to go. Dear Jackie, when you invited me to come to the golf tournament in Florida on February 21, I thought I would be able to work it into my schedule. That is the date I arrive in Peking. And even if we had an SST, I would be unable to be in both places at the same time. I wish you would extend my best wishes to all the big money winners at the tournament. And also to the losers.
We wanted to get this picture too. I think if you could sign that one. I think you want to sign it, Dick Nixon. Mrs. Nixon made it pass.
You know, I think that's a good family picture.
I do too.
Pat doesn't think it's so good. I think it's good. I think it's good. Is Julie here?
Hi.
Hi, Julie. How are you?
What are you working on?
Huh?
What are you working on?
Well, we got a couple of odds and ends. On your program, what kind of questions you can have in your television program? Will it be non-political, I hope?
Yeah. No, I think just any questions. You know, usually they want to know about...
You fend off the partisan questions, you know, any of those.
Well, the other day I didn't fend one off too well. David told me.
Well, after all, you have to be candid. Otherwise, they'll think you're just as stupid.
Right.
The moment you begin to act, the moment you begin to put on a show, then it kills it. It's one of the reasons, you know, I refuse ever to see myself on television. Have you ever seen yourself on television?
I've turned it off.
Yeah, always turn it off.
Because it makes you too self-conscious.
The moment you watch us on television and you hear people, you know, they practice their speeches before a mirror. I've often said to members of the cabinet, and I've often said to young congressmen and senators that are on the way up, they say, well, gee, I just don't want to make any mistakes. I want to be non-controversial. Well, that's fine.
Yeah,
no mistakes. Be non-controversial, and you'll be dull.
Yeah.
You'll be dull.
I'll see you when you get dressed for dinner tonight.
Yeah, you're not coming. Stay.
Right.
All right.
Okay, bye.
See you later.
The arrival of the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. This is handled, and just about everything else at the White House, with a kind of intense formality. Protocol is quite important to Richard Nixon. And the rules say the president waits in his office for the Prime Minister, which he does, whistling a small tune.
You have a little, not quite as far to come as some others, at least.
The Canadian press party meets the president. Mr. Nixon usually treats reporters as though they were cats, and he had an allergy to cats, but here he rises to the occasion.
Now look, Ron, I want to be sure that, so we don't discriminate, you know, against our neighbors to the north. They all get the presidential pins. We didn't have these before when you were here. But to any visiting press corpsman, they get the presidential pen. But with it, they can write anything they want.
Back in the Oval Office, the valet has brought in the president's dog, King Timahoe.
There we are. He's used to good furniture. Want to go out? Go out. Okay. Hold it. Okey-doke.
8 o'clock in the Blue Room. A black tie, stag, working dinner for about 40 men. While Mr. Nixon said goodbye to his Canadian guests, I went upstairs to have a word with Mrs. Nixon and her daughter, Tricia Nixon Cox.
All right, it'll only be a second. What about China? What are you going to take to China to wear? I
haven't figured that out yet. I'm more interested in what I'm going to see when I get there than what I'm going to wear.
Is it fair, or am I being indiscreet to say, are you going to the Soviet Union as well with the president?
That's right. That's the plan as of now.
He's here. I'm sorry, sir.
Well, how are you? I changed my, decided to get out of the, you want a sport coat, John?
Oh, I could put on a smoking jacket. I'll stay in this.
Well, I was listening to your interview.
Well, we've been talking about China.
Yes, and they're departing on the day of my birthday.
And so at the end of this day, what have we learned about Richard Nixon, the President of the United States? He's not as folksy as Harry Truman. He's harder working than Dwight Eisenhower. He's less stylish than John Kennedy. He's more formal than Lyndon Johnson. He is also something of an enigma, an orthodox Republican who invoked wage and price controls, an old hardline anti-communist who's going to Peking and Moscow. It is hard to know Richard Nixon, but it is also very hard to know the inner thoughts of any man who has his job. They are all, in the final sense, very much on their own, as Richard Nixon was on December 6, 1971.
Tomorrow on Today, the South African elections.
Also, the workforce of the future and the TV movie we've been waiting for. So join us tomorrow.
And see what a difference today makes.
College grads, millions are looking for work. How can your child get that?
All night, we've been talking about Richard Nixon's influence on American history. But 26 years ago, Richard Nixon had a profound effect on the life of a 13-year-old girl in Ohio.
You've probably never heard of her, and you probably don't even remember Vicki Lynn Gray's brush with history. She's almost 40 now, a mother and homemaker who's taking classes at Bowling Green State University. In 1968, she was Vicki Lynn Cole, a 13-year-old kid caught up in the excitement of that year's presidential campaign.
In the spring of '68, I was a supporter of Bobby Kennedy. I think probably every teenage girl in the United States was a supporter of Bobby Kennedy, and I wasn't any exception.
Please stay back. But in June of '68, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, crushing the hopes and idealism of thousands of his young supporters. In October, though, there was big news in Vicki Lynn's hometown of Deschler, Ohio. Richard Nixon was coming on a whistle-stop campaign, and Vicki and her friends decided they just wanted to see someone famous.
There was an announcement over the school system that anyone who wanted to be a Nixon girl should just show up at the fire station. They were going to give us little paper dresses, and we had a styrofoam hat, and they gave us each a sign to carry.
The well-organized Nixon campaign gave out signs to almost everyone in Ohio who turned out for him.
The sign that I was given when we went to the fire station said, "LBJ convinced us to vote Republican." That certainly never would have made news.
But then came one of those little twists of fate. The crowd surged. In the crush, Vicki Lynn dropped the sign about LBJ.
We ended up by the train, and there was a sign on the ground, and I picked it up. The sign that I held up said, "Bring us together again."
Bring us together again. Nixon and his people saw Vicki Lynn Cole's sign, the sign she was holding, by accident. It was the perfect slogan for the closing days of Nixon's campaign, in a year that had seen so much turmoil. And on November 6, 1968, the day Nixon was declared the winner, he made it the theme of his very first speech as president-elect.
I saw many signs in this campaign, but the one that touched me the most was one that I saw in Deschler, Ohio, at the end of a long day of whistle stopping. A teenager held up a sign, "Bring us together."
It was incredible, the response that came after that. And when they tracked me down and found out that I was that person that held the sign, I was out of class for days on end.
Newspapers from coast to coast ran the story, and Vicki Lynn Cole was invited to the inauguration to meet the new president. Vicki Lynn just threw the original sign back on the ground after Nixon's train left town, so the Republicans made her a new one and staged some pictures. For Vicki, that was okay. By then, she started to really like Richard Nixon. But with all the anti-war protests and divisiveness of the Nixon era, and then Watergate, she realized her Bring Us Together Again sign would go down as an ironic little footnote to a Nixon saga that was filled with twists and turns.
Yeah, it was very ironic that even though Nixon used Bring Us Together and Forward Together as his theme for his administration, that when his administration was over, the country was more divided and torn apart than ever.
Vicki Lynn Gray still describes herself as a fan of Richard Nixon's. When he had a stroke last week, Vicki Lynn called the hospital. She conveyed her sympathy to Tricia and Julie, her one-time campaign companions. We'll be right back.
Passion of his times. He said many times that unless a person has the goal, a new mountain to climb, his spirit will die.
To know the secret of Richard Nixon's relationship with the American people, you need only to listen to his own words. You must never be satisfied with success, he told us. And you should never be discouraged by failure. Failure can be sad, but the greatest sadness is not to try and fail, but to fail to try. In the end, what matters is that you have always lived life to the hilt.
On behalf of all four former presidents who are here, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, and on behalf of a grateful nation, we bid farewell to Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
The president's schedule begins this day as he leaves his bedroom on the second floor of the White House to go down to the first floor for breakfast with some friends and some enemies, the leaders of both parties in the Congress. He usually takes a quick look at the newspapers, but he does look at the sports pages with more care. These meetings take place often.
But I haven't had a chance to talk to Mike about this, but the House is almost universally of the opinion that as late as
a Spanish-born American named Manolo Sanchez.
This has taken neutral position. Second, they feel that the UN position, which is overwhelmingly...
Henry Kissinger.
Okay, fine, we'll call you later. All the trips are in good shape. Well, there's that. I don't know what we're going to do in our spare time. Just look at that schedule over the weekend. You seen it? Well, you leave for the Azores on Sunday afternoon, and we're in Bermuda the following Monday. We're in...
Richard Nixon, When Now continues.
The death of Richard Nixon and his funeral here today has given us an opportunity to reflect on his public and private life. He was to the end a man of contradictions, almost painfully shy and reserved, yet always in the public arena. Politics were his life, and when he was elected America's 37th president, he was a man ready for that office, for the power, for the trappings, the place in history that comes with the...
The President of the United States, unlike most people, gets to walk to work about a quarter of a city block from the mansion to the offices in the West Wing, and he walks this day with House Republican leader Gerald Ford. Here, he warns Jerry Ford that a camera is pointed at him. The President was not unaware of the cameras while we were there. And this is the famous Oval Office, the President's official place of work. The President drinks several cups of coffee during the day, usually served by his valet.
Russ, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He didn't let many see the inner workings of the Nixon presidency in personal style, but in 1971, my colleague John Chancellor and NBC News cameras spent a day with Richard Nixon. The program aired one time on NBC, and it has not been seen since. Now, almost a quarter of a century later, it is a portrait of history. Some of the people you'll see later would go to prison. Two would become president. And in the middle of it all, Richard Milhouse Nixon. It was December 6th, 1970.